Hey guys, what's up? We're back for another episode of Meta Saturdays. That's never gonna sound good. This is absolutely crazy though. This is unprecedented. I have, at this point in time, done 3 weeks in a row. Haven't missed a beat except for one of the weeks it was like a day or two late, but don't worry about that. But basically, I saw the comments. I saw you guys were like, you know what? This is a fun, cool thing. Good joke, Swim. You know, weekly series, tee-hee. You're never going to be able to pull it off. Just want to say to all the doubters out there, 3 weeks. We're nuts. All right. So just to sort of preface what we're going to be talking about in this episode, well, I've got some very special things for you guys. Check this out. Whoa, look. Isn't this crazy? There's a bit of a site update. In fact, this is what I've been working on for the past 2 days. You guys might have noticed I haven't really been streaming or putting out YouTube videos, and this is why, and it's all finally done. So what we have here is little collapsing panels, which is nice, and most importantly, that allows me to put more decks on the site using some of these sections that are going to keep it a little bit more organized that I just couldn't possibly have fit all these decks before. And that allows for a couple of new categories that I wasn't able to display before. We've got the actual new decks this week, which is, as you guys might know, that the title of this thing that I've been doing last week, I mentioned that we didn't really have a fully functional new deck segment. Now we do. As well as budget decks. These are decks that I have handcrafted specifically just like through trying to be as efficient with the new cards as possible, and I'll go over them, but they were also designed to be new player friendly, and it's great. I've been wanting to host like a budget decks, like a little budget deck section on my site for a very long time, but it's always been kind of too messy without being able to, fit more decks here with these collapsing sections. So I'm going to spend the episode going over general meta trends, and then we're going to be covering, the new decks this week. And, I'll show off the budget deck section since it's, new to the site as well. And this is kind of what we're going to be doing every week. This is the vision of the new series. I kind of need to explain it here because the last couple of episodes honestly did a very poor job of this, of explaining kind of what I had in mind. But basically, I'm going to be going over meta trends. We're going to spend less time talking about, old decks. I'll talk about, which decks are rising and which decks have some impactful card changes. But for the most part, I'll be talking about the broad meta trends and then focusing on, some of the new decks that have potential that might be more interesting to check out. So real quick, this is the weekly segment where I show you guys the best decks in the game, and these are all my personally built decks for various archetypes. If you guys want any of these decks for yourself, go ahead and go to the pinned comment where you can access this and go to the Mobalytics links for any of these decks. I'm not going to be talking about every single one of these decks in this video, but any deck that I don't go over is still a deck that's going to be getting updated. I update all of these decks on the week when I put out these videos, so if you're using any one of these decks, you can go ahead and refresh, open the new Mobalytics link and get an updated version for the current week. Metas change a lot and the cards change with it, so updated version means you're going to be winning more games. So just a couple of quick notes. While I was trying to set this up on the website, I actually might have ended up breaking a couple of things. It's actually the orders of these decks are this week going to be completely random within their tiers because at a time of recording, I seem to have lost the ability to order the decks within the tiers. So, don't look into the fact that Ashe Marauders is at the top of tier 2. Right now, every deck within a tier, this week only, is going to be considered equal. So the meta trends in a nutshell this week: Thresh Nasus and Aurelia Azir are staying true to just being the kings of the meta without really any exception right now. And this was something that, nobody's, you guys aren't really surprised about this. Come on. So yeah, very good decks. But largely we've seen two major trends, major patterns happening here, which is that this week the Watcher combo controller, or Lissandra Trundle control, has gotten a lot more representation, especially at the highest ranks in Masters. And this is for a couple of reasons. As you can see, this is a slightly modified version of the deck for this week. And Lissandra Trundle is a better deck in this format because even though it loses to Aurelia Azir, it actually beats pretty much every other deck out there right now. And in part, they have Aurelia Azir to thank for that, paradoxically, because Aurelia Azir is keeping certain checks out of the meta. Like, for example, one of the natural predators of Lissandra Trundle is Deep. In fact, that's one of the reasons to play Deep right now, because it's very favorable in Lissandra Trundle, as you can see here in the little matchup thing we have, weak against Deep. Well, you know, Azir Aurelia absolutely smashes Deep, so it's keeping Deep decks a little bit lower play rate, as well as other counters to Lissandra Trundle, like more conventional styles of Demacia deck, like non-dragons. Dragons actually does pretty poorly into Lissandra Trundle because their big units just get frozen just at the wrong time, and that means that Lissandra Trundle, while normally being somewhat unfavorable against some kinds of Demacia decks, doesn't really have those to deal with right now and only has dragons, which they're fine with. So Lissandra Trundle has re-entered the meta in a pretty major way at this point in time. I would have it at the very top of tier 2 if I didn't break the ability to order the decks on my site this week. Additionally, we're seeing a little bit more representation of the Fiora, all-in Fiora archetype. I've actually encountered this list quite a bit on ladder in the last week. And yeah, this is mostly my fault because this was the deck that I climbed to Masters with this season. I think it's one of the few, I mean, if you guys saw my climb to Masters, you know that I tried a bunch of hipster decks because I wasn't going to climb with a meta deck. And Fiora ended up being kind of like the hipster deck that ended up being the most viable for the climb right now. And it's pretty good into this meta. Now, when you get to the high levels and there's more Ezreal Draven and Lissandra Trundle, it definitely falls off. But for the most part, it happens to do favorably against both tier 1 decks, those being Thresh Nasus and Aurelia Azir, which is really amazing. It stomps Thresh Nasus in general, and against the Aurelia Azir, well, until the Aurelia Azir players figure out that they just need to homecoming their own dais, and then there's nothing you can do about that as the Fiora player, you're still at least pretty favorable overall. Although, I mean, it's close. Now, with Trundle Lissandra becoming a little bit more popular at high ranks, we also have a bit of a second coming of Shurima Overwhelm, a deck that's been kind of flickering in and out of existence for a while, but it happens to be one of the few decks that, if played at, you know, a high level, both decks played at a high level, this is one of the few decks that actually does have a favorable matchup into Trundle Lissandra control. So it's a pretty popular deck to come back, especially with Azir Aurelia's play rate dipping, although I expect it to make a little bit of a return as, you know, more Overwhelm decks, more Lissandra Trundle decks come up. And the last deck to talk about this week is going to be Dragons. Dragons is a deck that I personally find to be a bit overrated. I know that there's some players that think that this is a tier 1 deck, and I certainly wouldn't call it tier 1. I think it's a very solid deck that has its place in the metagame, but its matchup tables aren't really as powerful as a lot of people say. I think the reason a lot of people like Dragons is because, so here's the thing. Right now, we're in a very polarized meta. A lot of ladder feels kind of like rock, paper, scissors, and a lot of matchups are just you queue with the deck and you just hope you hit the favorable matchup. Because there's a lot of like 70-30 and 30-70 matchups right now, and it doesn't feel great. I think the reason that a lot of people like Dragons is, for the most part, you have pretty good control over your games. If you are a player that hates polarized matchups, if you just want to feel like every game you at least have some control, some chance, I would recommend a deck like Dragons or a deck like Ezreal Draven are two archetypes that I think are very good for, you know, if you just hate the feeling, and I know a lot of players do, of just queuing into a match and it being 70 or 30 from the start. This is one of the biggest problems that I think LoR is going to have to address, and there's a lot of factors that are adding to it, but both Aurelia Azir and Trundle Lissandra are pretty major culprits. But yeah, that's part of the reason why I think Dragons kind of feels a little bit better than it's actually performing right now, just because you don't have to have those, like, you know, super hopeless, unplayable matches so much. I mean, you're not great into Trundle Lissandra control, to be perfectly honest. Although, here's a fun fact. Part of the reason I'm cutting down on blue Sentinels in this deck is actually because of the Trundle Lissandra control matchup. Again, now that that's becoming a little bit more popular, it's been growing in popularity over the last week. Blue Sentinel is a hilarious liability in that matchup because Trundle Lissandra can just use Fading Memories on your blue Sentinel, and they'll generate an ephemeral blue Sentinel. And the funny thing is, an ephemeral blue Sentinel is much stronger than a normal blue Sentinel because you can choose when it dies, so you can choose when it ramps you. So they just play their ephemeral blue Sentinel on like turn 6 And then they're at turn 8 a turn early for free. And there is actually one extra deck worth talking about, which is Ashe Nox this week. It's doing very well with how the metagame is shifting in an environment with a few more people on dragons, as well as a few more people on Trundle Lissandra. Ashe Nox is a archetype that does pretty decently into those, does very well against dragons, and it's able to hold its own against Trundle Lissandra, which is great. This is, of course, my version, which is currently still running Marauders, but you can just play the Hearthguard version if you prefer it. It's very, very close to the Marauders version. I slightly prefer Marauders because I think it's a little bit better into both Trundle Lissandra and Ezreal Draven right now. But again, the Hearthguard version is super close. Now, as we can see, Ashe is a deck that is weak against aggro. And generally speaking, and you'll see this in basically every meta, by the way, this is just one of the trends of Runeterra that you're almost always going to see. This is a universal, which is that aggro tends to be less popular at super high ranks than, you know, in like the diamond or plat ranks. And lower, of course, which is to say, you know, if you're at lower ranks, Ashe Marauders isn't going to be as good because you're going to be seeing more aggro, and that is a weak matchup. If you're higher ranked, you're going to be seeing less aggro and a lot more of these decks like dragons and like, you know, Trundle Lissandra that Ashe has a really good place in the metagame for. So that's pretty much the rundown of the current meta. Right now, we're seeing a bit of a triangle between Thresh Nasus, Aurelia Azir, and Lissandra Trundle Control that is going to be dominating tournament environments. We're going to see, assuming that there's no balance changes impactful, which there probably will be some impactful ones in the next balance update, but barring that, we're going to be seeing a lot of that trifecta of decks. Usually Trundle Lissandra versions will just outright ban Aurelia Azir in most tournament formats, and be just fine with that since this is one of the few decks in the current meta that is actually very good at dealing with a Trundle Lissandra player playing the deck very well. Now, at this point, this is where a lot of you guys are going to be wondering, well, Swim, if Trundle Lissandra is so good, then why is it in tier 2 instead of in tier 1? And I'll tell you why. There's actually a couple of reasons. First of all, it's not necessarily like as much of a meta-stable deck as Thresh Nasus and Aurelia Azir. I don't think it's able to sustain as high of a play rate to win rate ratio. But the bigger reason right now is that Lissandra Trundle's overall win rate at high ranks isn't actually that high. The reason being is it's a pretty difficult deck to play. Now, it's always one of the trickier things when maintaining a tier list, this idea of balancing out, you know, decks that are easy to play or difficult to play. And a lot of people have mentioned in the past that, you know, and some of you guys are very well aware of this, that my tier list is a little bit skewed towards easier decks to play. And that's because this is a tier list mostly intended for players in, you know, high ranks, but a lot of players like trying to climb to masters or in low masters where a lot of these, you know, powerful decks don't really apply as much. And it's sort of balanced around that, right? Now, the reason I'm bringing this up now is because the update to the site I'm going to make next week is one that is going to get a lot of that in line by having a more prominent difficulty meter for decks. You guys will hopefully be able to see what I mean, but I'll be able to bring a balance to the idea of kind of like weighing difficulty with effective win rate, which is something that's pretty tricky to do. I mean, when you think about putting up a tier list, right? In an ideal universe, yes, I'd be able to say that these decks are hard and, you know, you're not going to be able to achieve tier 1 win rates with them unless you play them very well, right? But not a lot of people will actually be able to, you know, register that fully. Like, if I put Lee Sin as tier 1 and put it as like a hard difficulty deck, it's going to be net decked by a lot of people and is going to get like a 50% win rate because Lee Sin is a very difficult deck to play unless you play it absolutely perfectly. So basically, my solution is going to involve a way of being able to communicate the difficulty a little bit more to the players. So I'm going to be able to list things at tier 1 while being able to show very clearly that unless you play them very well, you will have a lower win rate. Which is not as easy of a thing to do as you might think, because a lot of players will just click tier 1 without reading anything else. And I mean, the sad reality of the situation is that's kind of how a lot of tier lists are going to work. I can't force people to read things as much as I write things and as much as the things I hope people read. It's really, really difficult to literally force someone to read something. And I do want you guys to do the best possible with these decks. All right. But yeah, I just wanted to make an announcement. That's going to be in the update next week, so watch out for that. Yeah, not only am I pumping these out weekly, but I'm doing weekly updates, baby. All right, now before we get into the new decks, I thought I'd actually go through a little bit of this meta report. This is Legna's meta report from our pubs, and it's something that there's a couple of interesting points here that I thought I'd discuss with you guys, but there's some data, and keep in mind, this is sort of a data-driven meta report from Masters rank only, and what that means is the Masters meta tends to be fairly insular. You're going to see somewhat different numbers at, if you look at like Plat Plus only, but this is definitely a peek into how things are looking at a high level. So just to go over a little bit here, we can see region's play rate, which is, the number of times a region is included in a deck. And we can see right now, Shurima has a absolutely massive representation. And the reason behind that is fairly straightforward. I mean, Shurima is present in Thresh Nasus, it's present in Aurelia Azir, Overwhelm, like I said, is on the rise, and even Shurima Swarm is still a very prominent aggro deck, right? So Shurima is, very, very represented. If you watched my video, I did a video talking about like some of the kind of like design issues with the game, and the biggest thing about Shurima is they're very strong in terms of like a small pocket of aggressive cards that carry them, but the core Shurima identity of like this sort of like combo oriented, sort of like securing a playstyle sort of package of cards, like which is most of the Shurima cards, is still fairly dysfunctional. So mostly this is just getting carried by the aggro kit. And we can see, Shadow Isles having really high representation, Ionia, Noxus, no real surprises here. The thing to draw attention to is the fact that Bilgewater has pretty much the lowest play rate of all time. Poor Bilgewater, man. I think that at this point in time, a lot of the pre-Targon nerfs that came out to Bilgewater probably could even be fully reverted, because a lot of the core Bilgewater identity kind of got a blow in that area. I think Twisted Fate is still perfectly fine as a card. I mean, he might have gotten slightly overnerfed, but I actually don't think so. I think TF is still a powerful archetype. It's still working very well, and TF will have other opportunities. It's a card that's very, very scalable. I think his position is actually slightly underrated in the meta right now. But for the most part, Bilgewater is just like core package of cards. Just isn't really doing what they've meant to be doing for basically the longest time. For those of you guys who don't know, the Targon expansion in like the tail end of kind of like the Rising Tides era saw a lot of power creep to a lot of the game mechanics, and the reality of the situation is right before that happened, a bunch of cards got nerfed, and these Bilgewater cards were among them, and it feels sort of like placeless now. Like a lot of the nerfs feel kind of redundant with the power level of a lot of things in the game right now. For example, even, Make It Rain was considered a crazy card at 2 mana, back then. But at this point in time, Make It Rain could probably be 2 mana again without causing any sorts of major issues. Personally, yeah, Make It Rain and some of the plunder cards, like, Black Market, some of the, like, the Gangplank Sejuani kinds of plunder cards, like the Nab package, as well as Yordle Grifter, I think could definitely see a little bit of a tweak. And if you guys haven't guessed already, the sad reality of the situation is Bilgewater's best deck right now is Deep, of all things, which Deep is a cute anti-meta deck. I mean, it'll see some tournament representation, but it's not generally considered a powerhouse deck, especially on ladder. It's always been much more of a tournament deck than a ladder deck for several reasons. And yeah, the fact that Bilgewater's best representation is Deep is not a happy fact for Bilgewater. And then there's the champion combinations. We see Azir Aurelia and Nasus Thresh are both basically chilling at effective 20% play rate each of the latter, which is pretty high, but it's Masters, so I mean, this is where all the really sweaty tryhards come out. And as we can see, Draven Ezreal is up, and Lissandra Trundle is very much on the rise. A lot of the Dragons is actually kind of on its way out at the moment, seeing a little bit less play rate as it did in the first, week or two, and that's to be expected. And the last point of interest here is going to be the data-driven matchup table that was constructed for most of the popular decks by Legna here. And this is a pretty great matchup table. For the most part, I think that, master stats are going to show a fairly insular meta, but it is good at showing the general matchup tables for things. And a matchup table is something that, if you guys have been following this series for a very long time, you might actually remember there was a week or two where I actually did have an updated matchup table on my site. For many reasons, I had to discontinue the project, but let me just say, I have a good feeling that there might be a matchup table updated weekly on my site coming sometime in the near future. All right. For those of you guys who have never seen a matchup table before, you take the deck on the left, and the win rate is going to be reflected of this deck's performance into the deck on the column, right? So, for example, if you take Draven Jinx and you look at its matchup into Ashe LeBlanc, this column over here, well, you see Draven Jinx has a 75.4% win rate in Masters against Ashe LeBlanc based on the data collected here, right? And of course, with statistics, there's a lot of, different ways to interpret the data, and you want to make sure that, your sampling is exactly correct. So my matchup table would definitely look a little bit different from this, but for the most part, I don't think that there's going to be major inaccuracies in what we're seeing right now. This is going to be pretty accurately reflective of the general matchups. Now, I personally think it would be fantastic if Mobalytics, and for those of you guys who don't know, I work on the Mobalytics tier list as well as my own. I think it would be fantastic if Mobalytics had a section that was a automatically updating matchup table. It would have to be semi-curated. I would have to manage it and choose which decks to display and like how to define an archetype, which variants to include and which not to. But it could be mostly automated. Wouldn't it be fantastic if Mobalytics had a page like that? Wouldn't it? Even if you don't plan on playing in tournaments, and if you do plan on playing in tournaments, of course, matchup tables are incredibly essential. But even if you don't, even if you're just looking for ladder play, they're great tools for being able to detect, what are your favorite matchups? What are your unfavored matchups? You can just quickly look at them and be like, okay, let's say you want to counter Lissandra Trundle, right? You look through and you're like, wow, Azir Aurelia has a really good win rate into Lissandra Trundle, but I don't really want to play Azir Aurelia. Let's see. Oh, wow, look, Renekton Sivir is actually, wow, this is 70% against Lissandra Trundle. That's actually really high. I didn't realize it was that high. Let's play some Renekton Overwhelm and counter Lissandra Trundle, right? So matchup tables are really useful. And so that brings me back to Mobalytics, because here's the situation. There's, they're a company like any other, and they've got a list of priorities. But if you guys watching right now, if you guys were to show your interest and support for the construction of a feature like this by typing it out in a comment on this video so that I have something to show to the guys over at Mobalytics, I think we could definitely show them how much of a demand there is for this kind of thing, and together we could probably get this project started. I mean, fingers crossed. I'm not gonna, promise anything or announce anything on their behalf or anything like that. But I think just like showing how much of a demand there is for it would go a really, really long way. So if you guys want to leave a comment saying how much you would love this feature, I think we can make this happen. And with that, we've kind of covered all of the meta trends for this week. So now we get to the fun stuff. We get to talk about some of the new decks this week, which again, hilariously enough, I didn't have this as a segment last week, and I didn't really have it as a proper thing the first week either, even though this is the title of this series. So yeah, this is gonna be how it goes. After I talk about the general meta trends, we're gonna talk about some of the newer decks and where they're coming from. So our first new one is actually a bit of an old one. For those of you guys who might remember my Butterfly Fiora deck from way back in the day, it's actually in a really, really good position for a comeback right now. Big buff Sparklefly is gonna do very well into Aurelia Azir, and there's not a ton of like super control-y decks that are going around right now. Normal Fiora is doing well, and Sparklefly is, a great elusive threat to the meta. Decks like Nasus Thresh have big problems with the elusive keyword. Decks like Azir Aurelia have big problems with the lifesteal keyword, so it ends up working out. So for those of you guys who might not be familiar with this deck, I've actually I've put a little look what's here, a little YouTube button. I wonder what happens if I press it. Well, it takes you to a video talking about the deck and how it works. God, is that really what my hair looks like? Jesus Christ. All right. Anyway, this is basically one of the features that I've been neglecting in the site for a very long time. No longer. I'm going to be adding more YouTube links to some of these. You guys might notice this section, this column has been really, really barren. I'm gonna be real, I kind of forgot it existed for a couple months. Man, it's blowing my mind how many features this website has. God, crazy. Anyway, Butterfly Fiora, for those of you guys who, haven't seen the majesty of this deck. Basically, you're either drawing a Fiora or you're drawing a Sparklefly, and whichever one you're drawing, you're buffing real big and, using stuff like single combat to win the game. It's basically just an all-in buff deck. We're using some rallies in the form of Golden Aegis, which is, of course, a mainstay in Fiora decks at this point. And we've even got Zoe for a sort of tertiary alt win con if we didn't draw either Sparklefly or Fiora, or if one of them died. So it's a fun deck. I'll probably be playing around with it on stream, once I remember that I do these daily streams. Haven't done them in a couple of days now. What's up with that? Yeah, over on twitch.tv/swimstream. Check it out. Anyway, it's a great deck, and yeah, it's actually a lot of fun. Works pretty well right now. Cithria Matron. So there's a lot of versions of Cithria Matron. This is one of the few new kind of like sort of archetypes that you can play in the new expansion, and everyone has their own version of this deck. I personally would really recommend not running Mobilize. I know that Teal Red's version runs Mobilize, and it was in some of the earlier versions of the deck, but for the most part, the successful versions have been cutting it. This is what I would recommend if you're interested in playing the Cithria Matron game plan. And of course, the game plan culminates in trying to stack a big board and then using usually Matron on Cithria. Sometimes you can cheat it out early with an Oblivious Islander to be able to, get a big buff, give everything Challenger. Sometimes just kill them on that turn. I also like the Shyvana version of this deck at the current point in time because it does pretty well against a lot of the kind of like tempo-oriented game plans right now. For the most part, people have been asking me, why I haven't put, a Cithria Matron version on my site in a while. And I mean, the biggest reason is just because these decks have really low win rates. So here's Teal Red's version that I was talking about earlier with a 45% win rate. I would not generally recommend this archetype to any competitive-minded players, but in a refined version, it's actually not that bad. It does generate some interesting matchup tables. It is favorable in the Demacia Mirror right now. So as long as you're playing this version, it actually does have some potential as a deck. I could see messing around and trying to refine this archetype, and it's not impossible. I could be bumping this up from the new deck slot this week. All right, next up we've got Concurrent Trundle. Now this is a spicy one. A lot of people have tried Concurrent Timelines Trundle in the past. Mostly, of course the gimmick is that Concurrent Timelines will turn Trundle's Ice Pillar into in 0 mana 8/8 or whatever, right? If it turns into a Pharaon, or I mean really anything, if it turns into an Uzgar, the fact that you're getting a really big body plus it's refilling you the 8 mana for free is a really crazy synergy point. I mean, when you think about it, Concurrent Timelines, even when it's just being used on Ice Pillar and it's not even hitting other units for the rest of the game, for 1 mana to turn your Ice Pillar into a really beefy boy, even if it doesn't nut, even if it just pulls like Uzgar the Ancient or something, that's still really, really good value you're getting out of your 1 mana card. So it's a strategy that works pretty well. What I have for you is 4LW's version of Concurrent Trundle that he brought to this week's Fight Night. 4LW is a very good player and deck builder, and it's a very interesting take on the concept. So it's experimental, it's new, but it's something to try out. And of course, this version is also using the 3 It That Stairs and the 3 Buried in Ice for the sick combo of setting up a Buried in Ice into an It That Stairs. If you're, playing out this kind of deck, this is a very powerful combo that you're going to have to be planning around a little bit. Make sure you're banking just enough mana so that you can use Buried, followed by It That Stairs the subsequent turn to wipe the opponent's entire board. All right, now you might notice I'm kind of like cheating a little bit with new decks this week because Fisting Riven and Talia Thralls were kind of on this site last week, but here's the thing though, the new deck section wasn't on the site last week, so I can technically throw these in. Now, the twist here is that I've added back in Swool Squirrel to try out a version that has been doing pretty well. Swool Squirrel actually does have some cute implications into this metagame right now, and it can set up some crazy, just like out of the world kills with both Dragon Rage and most importantly, survival skills to protect your entire combo. You can do some stuff with Might and Whirling Death with Swool Squirrel and just get carried away like that. So I've gone back to it, and I actually think that this Riven Draven archetype is pretty underrated. This is one that I plan on playing a lot in the next week actually, because I think I can refine this quite a bit further. It's a very, very, very undervalued archetype. All right, so this is kind of like how this series is meant to work. You know, this is a sneak peek into what this sort of new decks segment is supposed to add to my weekly series, which is just, yeah, we're going over some decks that, you know, are good this week. Some of them are decks that I've built, some of them are decks off the stat, some of them are decks that other people have built that are decks that are doing pretty well, you know, in one way or another, that are going to be experimental. It's going to be a constant rotation. These slots are going to be rotating every single week, of course. And what that means is, you know, when a deck goes out, it'll probably just vanish from the site for the time being until maybe it gets rotated back in quite a bit later. But some decks that end up being good enough will actually get rotated up into, you know, a tier 2 deck or like an off meta tier 3 deck. Absolutely. So that'll be kind of like the interest of the new decks, seeing which ones get rotated out and which ones actually might have some staying power. And lastly, just to close this out, we have budget decks, which is actually something that I'm very, very excited to actually finally have a dedicated spot on the site for budget decks. I know a lot of you guys might not care about this because I know all of my viewers are like high masters players, and like you guys are like jamming 2 or 3 tournaments every single week. So, you know, the notion of a budget deck section for newer players probably doesn't interest you guys as much on average, but I think it's still going to be a very helpful resource for a lot of players looking for this. So I've designed these decks. I actually took a lot of time building these decks to be as optimal as possible for, of course, the starter collection, you know, trying to use as little crafting resources as possible, or only crafting things that are going to be very useful in other decks, as well as sort of designing the decks to be slightly new player friendly, and of course giving, you know, a kind of like little guide here that should hopefully help out a little bit more as well. So these are, and I'll be adding a few more budget decks later this week. As you guys might see, this one isn't a deck yet. I need to make it still. But I'll be adding a few more budget decks later this week, and then for the most part, I don't expect this section of the site to really change much at all. It will mostly just stay the same, because budget decks don't really change much over time, but I'll build them, and they'll be around. I'll probably make a YouTube video talking about, you know, the budget decks that I've made as kind of like a one-time thing, and it'll just be around for, you know, if you guys are introducing new friends to the game, and you're like, oh, you know, here's a starting point, check out one of the budget decks to start with on Swim's site. Hopefully will be useful for some of you guys. And yeah, that's it. That is this kind of like Runeterra this week. I kind of want to start, you know, talking a bit more in these sorts of weekly videos. I also kind of want to talk a little bit about like the news and kind of like what's happening in Runeterra this week. You know, maybe talking a little bit about like, you know, if there's like Reddit discussions and stuff like that. I'm not really able to fit that in right now, but I think that would be a really cool thing to have this segment not only be like the meta this week, but sort of Runeterra this week. You know, I think that'd be fun. But yeah, this is kind of like what I had in mind for the new structure of the new series. And now that we're 3 episodes in, I can finally show you guys how it's sort of supposed to look in my head. Hopefully this all works for you. Looking at the site in front of me, I've just realized that the site also has functionality to be able to hover certain cards that I just forgot to apply to any of these. So I'll be doing that too. God, this site is just full of features like this. That's crazy. All right, guys. So that's it for the Runeterra meta this week. Remember to, you know, leave a comment about that, you know, Mobalytics matchup tables thing. And I'll see you guys next week.